Hi everyone, I'm Cari for Granny B's Old Fashioned Paints. Today we are going to talk about how to paint your furniture. It seems like a pretty easy process, and it really is, but there are a few things that you need to know before you get started just to help you build up your paint layers and ensure that you have a beautiful finish when you're done. So we're going to do a couple of painting tutorials on different woods, and also talk about a couple things that will help you along the way, including decanting some of your Granny B's paints into a smaller container. This will help you so that your paint doesn't dry out in the can and you can keep it fresh in a smaller container as you go. Another key point, when you're getting your brush ready, you want to just make sure that you put about a third of the way up into your bristles when painting. If the paint starts to get up into the head of the brush, then the bristles don't lay nicely or flat, and it can make some marks, and also it gets junked up in there, and that's not good for the brush. So you have to make sure that you just put about a third of the way up. That's all you need, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. We also did a video on how to prep your furniture, so please make sure that you watch that video because that will help you get your pieces ready for paint. We typically don't recommend sanding, especially on darker wood or wood that's got older varnish or oils on it. You just kind of want to seal it. It may not be necessary, but if you feel that it is, and you're painting on wood such as pine or teak, they do have bleed-through issues. So no sanding, because that will, it make the furniture varnish, the old knots in the pine bleed through your paint, especially if you're going over a darker piece with lighter paint colors, okay? So really all you need to do is watch our beginner video on how to prep your furniture, and it'll tell you everything that you need to know. All right, so we're gonna get started. Okay, so I've decanted my paint into another container to make sure that my 1 liter container does not dry out. And I've loaded my brush, and you can see that I've just loaded it just that much. That's really all you need. And you're gonna get started by just adding a simple light layer. And I just like to go in the direction of the wood grain. That's just a preference for me. And I just give it one nice even coat. And you just want to make sure that you get all the little nooks and crannies as well. And that's it. And then once the paint starts to set up, you want to leave it alone. Don't worry about brush strokes or marks or anything like that, because those level themselves out. And if you start trying to work it too much and try to get all those paintbrush strokes out of the paint finish, you'll start to overwork the paint just a little bit. Just add your layer and let the paint do its thing. I also like to make sure that when I go into corners and things like that, I just kind of dab my brush like this, and then I just pull the paint back out. So as you can see, I've started here on the tabletop, and it's just got a nice even finish. Now, I am going over a darker finish with a lighter color paint, so this will take a couple of light coats. But like I said, you don't want to add too much at first because it will affect the paint finish. Just be patient and add a nice light layer at a time, and after about a half an hour of that coat on that piece, you can go ahead and start adding the next coat until you're happy with the coverage and the color. Right now I'm using Granny B's Beach Sand color. So it's going on really beautifully, as you can see. And I'm just going to continue to add a layer to this piece and then let it dry for a half an hour, and then go back and add my second coat. Also, you have to realize that environmental conditions do affect the dry time of your paint. So if it's a little bit more humid outside, it may take a little bit longer to dry. Cooler weather conditions, same thing applies. So you just want to keep that in mind when you are painting your pieces. And you want to just make sure that you give it maybe a little bit more dry time and those kind of conditions, and you should be fine. But the chalk paint sets right up. It has a wonderful adhesion properties, so it goes right onto most surfaces, including glass, ceramics, fabrics, and melamine. So it's really a very beautiful, versatile paint, and it makes painting your furniture so. Another thing to mention, when you're painting a furniture piece and you're doing legs like this, and you're doing one side at a time, what I like to do to make sure that my edges stay nice and crisp without a lot of paint that's gobbed onto the little corners here is once I paint one side, I'll take my finger and just run it along this edge, and it just helps ensure that there's not globs of paint happening here on the edges. That keeps my edges nice and clean and perfect. So once this side is done, then I'll go to this side and start painting on this side. Okay, and then I'll repeat it. I'll repeat it here as well because this side isn't painted yet. So I'll just take my finger and run it along the edge and remove any extra paint that may have gone over onto the other side that's been scraped off my brush, and it just helps to keep those edges nice and clean. And another tip as well, if you put on your first layer of paint and you have to run and do something really quickly, and you don't have time to wash your brush, or you don't want to wash in between coats, you can take your brush and put it into a Ziploc baggie or wrap it with cellophane or Glad wrap, and that'll keep the bristles nice and moist so that when you go to add the second coat, you're ready to go and you don't have to wash your brush. Okay, so here on this little table, you can see what it looks like with this, just the first coat of paint on the top of this little table. And it looks about the way I expected it to look. So you can still see some variation in color through the paint, but we, again, went over a darker surface with a lighter color paint. So this is to be expected, and this is about how it should look. So I am going to go ahead and give it a second coat, and that should do it, and that should look perfect once I do. But again, I'm going to give it a little bit of time to dry before I go ahead and start adding the next coat. Okay, so while I'm waiting for my first coat of paint to dry on my little table, I wanted to go back and talk about something I'd mentioned earlier in the video. And I mentioned bleed through. That is where the natural tannins in the wood will come through the paint even after it's painted with layers and sealed. That is typical of certain woods, especially pine and teak. It's also typical of anything that's been varnished with a dark stain or with waxes. And typically you'll find sometimes too, like the knots of the wood, the natural knots, like in pine for instance, those will show up through the paint finish sometimes. So one way to avoid that is by taking that furniture piece, clean it, and then add a primer. The primer will help ensure that everything is sealed and stays in place, so when you go to add your paint finish, it'll be perfectly fine. You also want to avoid sanding any of these pieces because sanding actually will create the bleed through sometimes because you are opening up the wood and actually bringing that out of it again. So don't sand. Use a primer, or you could also use Armor. Grainy Bee's Armor Sealer is fantastic, and I've actually used that quite a few times myself on some of my pieces. And I've never had an issue. But if you are concerned about that and you're not sure, take extra steps just to make sure that that wood is nice and sealed properly, and when your paint finish is done, you don't have to worry about it. Now let's say that you did paint a furniture piece and some of that does start to come through. Like maybe you didn't prep it well enough and you see it start to come through maybe a month or two later, which does happen. So what you want to do is take our Armor Sealer. You can use the matte finish, which is nice and soft, and just go over the entire piece and then just give it one coat, and that should do the trick. All right, so we just don't want to see those furniture pieces that you've spent so much time preparing and painting to look differently than you intend them to be. So just make sure you take extra precautions when it comes to certain things like that, so it doesn't cause you extra work, money, and you will still have a beautiful piece. All right, Well, I'm finished applying the 2 coats of Granny B's Old Fashioned paints to this little table, and I am so pleased and happy with the results. As you can see, the coverage is beautiful, especially over that darker finish, which is typically harder to cover. But just 2 even coats did the trick. So next I will decide what kind of sealer I'm going to put on this. I think I'm going to go with Armor Matte because this little table is going to be next to the sofa and it's going to see glasses and plates and all kinds of activity, I think. But I'll share that with you soon, and maybe a technique on this table before I'm completely finished with it. But I hope you were able to learn something today, and I appreciate you watching this video. Please follow us on Facebook under Granny B's Old Fashioned Paints and Granny B's Painting Studio, which is an amazing group on Facebook where people share all kinds of projects and ideas and ask lots of questions. Very informative. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay notified and updated on more videos to come. Thanks so much for watching.